was placed inside an innocuous-looking black backpack. It was then left on a bench along the parade route for Spokane, Washington's Martin Luther King Day parade on Monday. Law enforcement sources have described it as a sophisticated device capable of inflicting multiple casualties. They say it was packed with shrapnel and it was set to a remote detonator. The bomb was discovered before it went off. City workers saw something and said something. They alerted police, who then called in the bomb squad. They rerouted the march. The bomb squad disabled the device, and now the hunt is on to find out who is responsible and what this attempted bombing means. The FBI is now confirming that its investigation into this intended bombing will focus on two things. One, of course, is forensics. They have the bomb. The other is the often violent history of the white supremacist movement in this particular part of the country. The special agent in charge of the FBI's Spokane office tells the Spokesman Review newspaper that much will depend on what it finds out from the FBI's lab in Quantico, Virginia, where the backpack bomb was sent for analysis earlier this week. The special agent said, quote, "A lot of this is going to turn in part on results of the lab analysis." As for where investigators may hope that evidence will lead them, the FBI in Spokane is confirming to the Spokesman Review that two recent protests by white supremacists in nearby Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, will be part of the Bureau's efforts to identify potential suspects, motives, and leads. Quote, "We will examine every avenue," Special Agent Harrell said. "We are reaching far and wide in terms of what we are looking at. That," meaning the protests in Coeur d'Alene, "certainly will be one of them." It's about 29 miles as the crow flies from Spokane over Washington state's eastern border to the city of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The white supremacist movement in the Pacific Northwest has long centered on that region, on the Spokane Valley and northern Idaho. In Coeur d'Alene, in 1973, a man named Richard Butler founded a compound for his white supremacist group known as Aryan Nations. A local task force that tracks hate crime in the region says after Aryan Nations set up camp, it tracked more than 100 felonies committed by hate groups in that region throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. They included that 4-month crime spree in 1996 we told you about last night, in which a pipe bomb was detonated at Spokane City Hall. The men indicted for that pipe bombing in Spokane were convicted ultimately of triple murder. Prosecutors describing what they said was a plot to overthrow the government and set up a whites-only nation in the Pacific Northwest. Incidents of violence across the region died down after Richard Butler was bankrupted in a civil lawsuit brought against him in the year 2000, and Aryan Nations lost its miserable little Idaho home base. Mr. Butler died in 2004, and as the Spokesman Review reported today, much of the hate-motivated crime spree in that region ended with him, until recently at least. The police chief in Spokane, Ann Kirkpatrick, says her department has recorded an increase in white supremacist activity over the last 2 years. Nothing, she says, that she or her department can pinpoint as a precursor to Monday's attempted bombing at the Martin Luther King Day parade, but the chief described a definite uptick in incidents overall over the past 2 years, a trend that is backed up by the task force that tracks hate crime activity in that region. The leader of that task force calls what they are seeing there a reemergence and something that is not to be taken lightly. It's been 3 days since someone failed in their attempt to set off a powerful bomb along the route of a Martin Luther King Day march in a part of the country that has a violent history with extreme racism. National news coverage of this attempted bombing is still sporadic. There has been an uptick today, but still sporadic. That's even after the FBI confirmed it was focusing its investigation, at least in part, on the potential that this is domestic terrorism committed by presumptively homegrown extremists. Joining us now is New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. Mr. Herbert, thanks for coming in.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm okay. I do continue to be surprised that this thing in Spokane is not getting more attention. Are you surprised by that?
I'm not surprised. This is such a violent country, and most of the country is in denial about the scale of the violence. So when you consider that tens of thousands of people are murdered in this country every year, since Dr. King was killed in 1968, Bobby Kennedy in 1968, more than 1 million Americans have died from gun violence. That includes homicides, suicides, accidental shootings, and that sort of thing. We more or less take this stuff in stride. Most people won't say that, but we do. So here you have a situation, potentially incredibly serious, obviously, but no one was killed. And it's not an attempt, a failed attempt by foreign terrorists, which really does get our attention in this country. And so I'm not surprised at all at the lack of attention to it.
Do you think there is, at least you can make sort of an analytical extrapolation between the level of person-to-person violence in this country, the level of even just gun violence used to settle things, commit crimes, or get people to get their way in this country, and the idea that political groups, hate-motivated groups, ideologically motivated groups will also use violence to try to get their way? You see those things along the same continuum?
I do, and the thing that links it all up to me is this sense of denial. So, you know, we're talking about gun violence, but in this case it was a bomb. But we had the Oklahoma City bombing. We've had terrible tragedies like Columbine and Virginia Tech. We've just gone through the Gabrielle Giffords situation. So shock and horror when the mass murders take place, no attention at all when the individual violence that you're talking about, you know, one or two people killed, that sort of thing. So it's just, to me, more of a sense of denial. So now you're talking, for example, about the white supremacist groups and the anti-government groups that profess violence on their websites and in their publications and stuff. I think we're in denial about that. I think we're in denial about the extent to which there's still an awful lot of race hatred out there, anti-Semitism, violence directed toward gays and that sort of thing. We're not paying the kind of attention to that sort of thing that we should. What I think we really need in this country is sort of a change in the culture. We have to recognize sort of the extraordinary, I think, insane levels of violence in this country and do the very hard work of actually changing the culture. You know, listen to the message of Dr. King. We still have, I think you mentioned it earlier in the week, we have a holiday to celebrate Dr. King, and we have marches and gatherings and that sort of thing. But we don't pay attention to his message. And his message was about nonviolence, and it was about fighting hatred in all of its forms. How
does America go about pursuing cultural change? One of the things that has happened in the wake of the Gabrielle Giffords shooting, the mass shooting in Tucson, is that we've had what is now a pretty sustained conversation, even for us, about why that happened, what can be done to prevent something like that from happening again, who is to blame for better and worse, I think, that conversation. Is that potentially constructive?
I think it doesn't hurt to have that conversation, but I don't think that's the kind of thing that is really helpful long term. What you need long term is a sustained effort by both public officials and activists in the private sector that will not let these things go away even when they leave the headlines. I mean, that's why Dr. King and the others in the civil rights movement were so important. They just kept pounding away, pounding away. That's why in the early days of the women's movement, when the leaders, when feminist leaders were being ridiculed, when women talked about changing the ways in which they were viewed by the society, they were laughed at, scorned, and that sort of thing, but never gave up, just kept pounding away. And that's what we would need to do, both in the area of violence in general, which I think is a profound problem, and in the continuing problems of race hatred, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hysteria, and that sort of thing, which we try in our denial to pretend that we have made great strides, but we try to pretend that those problems are still not very big problems. They are.
It's the difference between, you know, activism and news coverage. It's the difference between organizing and interest.
I think a good example, if I have a quick second, is the way you pursued on the air, for example, the don't ask, don't tell issue, and all the other people that were involved in that. They would not let that go, and then something big got done. That's really important.
Bob Herbert, columnist for the New York Times and smart guy. We know. I should say, I do want to be clear. We know so little about what happened with this event on Monday. We don't know. We don't think it was a foreign terrorist. We don't know if the FBI's pursuit of these white supremacist groups is going to lead to anything. We know so little at this time. But if it can be a constructive part of a continuing discussion about violence, as you're pointing out, I think we will learn a lot more than just about the individual perpetrator. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.